Welcome, everybody, to Learning With Lowell. Today, we're joined with Jacob Aday, postdoc at UCSF, did psychedelic research with the TRI program. He'll soon be a faculty member at the University of Michigan. He has over 20 plus publications centered around psychedelics. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sweet. So
Happy to be here.
one of the cool things that I thought you wrote about, which was separate than what I've seen other psychedelic researchers write about, is you delve into the historical context that most people would not know. Like, you talk about the history of it. So even one called the psychedelic zeitgeist, which makes it really easy to understand you're probably having fun with it. So what has been the psychedelic zeitgeist for the last 50 years?
Yeah, for the last 50 years, there's been a quite variable psychedelic zeitgeist. I would say there's probably two distinct psychedelic zeitgeists, one beginning in the mid 20th century and then one beginning at the beginning of the 21st century here. So in the mid 20th century, researchers became pretty excited about psychedelics after World War II. There was some early research into psychedelics before World War II, specifically into mescaline, which is the principal psychoactive alkaloid in peyote, the peyote cactus. But a lot of that died out with World War II. The researchers either went to war and died, or had their work diverted to other avenues, and so that research kind of died out after World War II. But in the early 40s, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was generating a bunch of new chemicals for this company named Sandoz, and one of them was called lysergic acid dithylamide 25. It was the 25th in an iterative series of lysergic acid dithylamides that he made. And he made it in 1938 originally. Didn't really find anything that notable with it. Put it on the shelf. And then in 1943, he just had this weird intuition that he should return to LSD 25. And he pulled it off the shelf and he was studying it again. And he got a little bit of it on his skin, and he experienced some weird sensations. And so he just decided to do a self-experiment with the compound, and he administered, I think it was 200 micrograms. I don't want to say exactly, 200 micrograms of LSD, somewhere a pretty sizable dose of LSD. When that became what's known as the first acid trip, the first LSD trip, and he documented the effects, and in short order, the company that he was working for, Sandoz, began making LSD freely available to clinicians and scientists to study it, and they gave it out, and it began being studied in therapy during the 1950s. And there's a lot of really promising work during that decade on psychedelic therapy for depression, alcoholism, and end-of-life distress. A lot of the same indications people are studying psychedelics for today. By the 1960s, the chemicals had really gotten out of the laboratory and became pretty closely associated with the hippie movement and the anti-war movement. And Richard Nixon famously said something along the lines of he couldn't make hippies illegal, but he can make the things that they liked illegal, included psychedelic drugs. And so there became a pretty swift prohibition of psychedelics and psychedelic research, and it was pretty much completely dormant for a couple decades through the 70s and the 80s. And then during the 90s, we had kind of the first kindlings of this new psychedelic renaissance. Dr. Rick Strassman at University of New Mexico began doing some research with DMT and then dimethyltryptamine, which is a pretty potent psychedelic. And he kind of snuck it in through the FDA, he under the guise of using DMT in a kind of psychotomimetic way, using it to model psychosis in patients and to better understand psychosis. And DMT didn't have the same baggage that things like LSD did. People didn't know necessarily what DMT was in the 90s. And so he did the first human psychedelic study in the mid 90s that had been done since the late 60s, early 70s. And that was successful, and it was human subject or healthy subjects, and no serious adverse events or anything. And so by the late 90s, in early 2000s, some researchers at Johns Hopkins decided to do the next psychedelic study of this era, which was a psilocybin study for healthy volunteers. And it took them a really long time to get the permission. Psilocybin is the active component in magic mushrooms. Over 200 species of mushrooms, of psilocybe mushrooms are found, and found all over North America and many different parts of the world. But they did the first modern study of psilocybin in the early 2000s. Like I said, it took a long time to go through all the DEA and FDA hurdles and get the study finished and published. It came out in 2006, and they had pretty remarkable findings. In this group of healthy volunteers, 2/3 of people rated this psilocybin experience as one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. Things up there with things like having a child or the death of a parent, things that are like that life-changing to an individual. And there are also pretty long-term changes in well-being as well that they documented. And this is the study that really kickstarted the modern era of psychedelic research. And the long-term changes in well-being made them think, hey, if these people, just feel better after this psychedelic therapy, maybe we should try it for clinical disorders like depression. Maybe they will feel better as well. And specifically, they started with cancer patients who had depression or anxiety associated with their terminal illness. And again, they found pretty robust and positive findings in this group that people had pretty enduring long-term reductions in their distress related to their death and their cancer diagnoses, pretty remarkable findings again here. And then ever since then, there's kind of been this gold rush of both pharmaceutical investment and academic universities getting in to see what else can psychedelic therapy be useful for. And at the moment, it's basically being explored for every psychiatric indication you can pretty much imagine. We can get into those more if you'd like. Yeah,
definitely. And it's a great overview. When you're mentioning the stuff, it sat on the shelves in the 20s, 30s, and then they were reintroducing LSD 25 in the 50s. It made me think of the book, The Immortality Key, where it looks like psychedelics has been a part of our species for some time, and which is kind of wild if you think about it. Like, what if religion and a lot of these other constructs that we hold dear have some underpinning in that way? And I don't think it invalidates it. I think it's an interesting from a historical standpoint.
No, I appreciate you mentioning that. Yeah, I guess I started the history with like the clinical research specifically on psychedelic therapy, but it's important to mention that these have a long history of indigenous use, and a lot of people have kind of held the torch for psychedelics during times of intense prohibition, and at great personal risk at a lot of times, including a lot of indigenous populations. And when Spanish conquerors came in 1500s or whatever, a lot of indigenous people had to use psilocybin in secrecy, and so it was largely forgotten about among non-native Westerners until like the late 1800s or so. And a lot of people even thought that psilocybin mushrooms were like a Native American myth for a long time, that they never even existed, that they were this this magical thing that didn't really exist, but it was just kind of a story among Native Americans. And actually, the scholars who had made that point that maybe they didn't exist kind of were the ones that were responsible for reigniting interest in psilocybin mushrooms at all. And they got researchers, anthropologists going down to Mexico and observing some native populations there, and verifying that indeed that there were mushrooms that were making them hallucinate and having pretty transcendent experiences.
Would you ever be interested in doing any ethnobotany like that, where you go down to the Amazon or you go down to meet indigenous tribes and just seeing it through their eyes? Like, I think ethnobotany is one of those things where it, on one hand, just like writing down everything that happened as they believe it is so valuable, because there are people, there are entire civilizations that are going extinct right now because the last few people who know them are dying. But what do you think about ethnobotany and your interest in it?
Yeah, I would love to do something like that. And I'd actually, it's it sounds really exciting. It's kind of like the stereotypical scientific expedition, you would see in a movie or something. You go down to the Amazon and study something exotic. yeah, I would love to do something like that. And actually intended to for my dissertation, where I collaborated with an ayahuasca retreat in Costa Rica, and yeah, they allowed me to contact their attendees and give them surveys related to things like gratitude and their relationships with nature and their engagement with art and aesthetic experiences before and after the retreat. And this is around 2020. And so in 2020, you couldn't really travel anywhere. You couldn't go across international borders or anything. And so unfortunately, the timing of my dissertation didn't really work out, and I didn't get to go down there. But I was able to still, give the surveys virtually, fortunately, and still able to do the project. But didn't get to go down there and get the full experience and really see what was going on like I would have liked to. But fortunately, they actually filmed a documentary there, so I was like, wow, that's pretty lucky. Yeah, like I can't go down there, but yeah, it's pretty. That's a nice alternative to have. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the documentary called? I'll have to watch it.
I'd have to look it up. If you Google Soltara Retreat Center documentary, it should come up.
Retreat. Okay, sweet. I'll check it out after this.
Yeah.
We had a person on here named Drea Burbank, who's down in, I believe, Colombia, and she's working on making carbon credits and creating alternatives for loggers and other indigenous people in the community, so they can build sustainable businesses, for the indigenous people and everyone else, for the planet and for them as well. But they do, I don't know what the term for this, but it's like tourism for psilocybin type stuff, psychedelics, where you can go down there and you can meet with the shamans and stuff. I think that's one thing that they're working and exploring. But yeah, if you want to go, Dre, if you're listening in, or we can facilitate that inquiry, because I think they do want scientists to go down there and research it, because it's such an untapped potential. There's so much human civilization like down there that is just waiting to be brought to everybody else. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. Yeah, if you could help us connect. Yeah, because I'm trying to form as many relationships as I can with those kind of retreat centers, because it's such a useful and resourceful way to study psychedelics. With these clinical trials, they're so expensive. It's like a 20-person clinical trial is about $1 million, like $50,000 per participant. Yeah, unreal amounts of money. And for my dissertation study, we collected data from like 80 people, and it costs like $500. It's like the scale differences in terms of costs are just unreal. Of course, there's more research limitations with doing these naturalistic designs, but in terms of, you have to kind of weigh the costs and benefits of each design. In terms of cost benefit, you can get a lot out of those studies, even though there's some limitations.
Yeah. What is it, the most expensive part that makes it 50,000? Just the medical infrastructure that you have to have there in case something bad happens in the clinical trials? Like what makes it the 50,000?
Yeah. Primarily the staffing and the infrastructure. Yeah. Because it's a very involved process getting involved in these clinical trials. You go through extensive screening to begin with. You typically have a phone screening to begin with the clinical research coordinator. You talk with them, and then you come in for in-person screening. You meet with a doctor. You have your blood draws, and you have a physical done, which is costs money. And you meet with a therapist, for an hour and a half, a couple times before the first dose. Therapist time is very expensive. Typically, there's 2 therapists as well, so double that. And then on dosing days, it's a very long day, 8-hour days which is very atypical therapy session. It's much longer than a typical therapy session, and accordingly costs much more as well, especially with, again, the 2 therapists there at the same time. And then, you also have, the PI, the principal investigator, the postdocs, the grad students, the people help coordinate things, help analyze the data, help write the papers. We have like a neuroimaging team on most studies, who are collecting things like MRI and EEG, before and after people go through these experiences. Clinical assessors as well to, screen them at the beginning to see if they have any, psychiatric disorders. So yeah, it's mostly staff costs. Yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure built into it. Yeah, which is a real issue for the field. At the moment, it's not really a scalable model. At the moment, most people can't even get good access to typical psychotherapy. So this very, this very supercharged psychotherapy with all these bells and whistles added on is really it's really hard to see how it's going to be accessible anytime soon with the way things are. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the Midwest where we're may or may not be from.
Yeah.
I just remember I shouldn't dox people.
Oh, no worries. Yeah. Pretty open about it. Yeah. People look at my resume and they're like, huh, Northern Michigan, Central Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All the same. No one be weird. So in the Midwest, they started closing down mental health clinics, and some of the biggest people as a population that went to them were veterans, and so then they had to go to hubs like Chicago, Madison, Iowa City, some of these, and it's like, oh, that makes sense. You go to these hubs, but it's like 2 to 3 hours, like one way, for someone to get help. And so, I mean, I was in the hospital once. I was on the way to go to the ICU myself, and there was a person who was just having an episode, and they were going from like really manic to just pleading with the police officers just surrounding them, crying like, I'm not trying to hurt anyone, I'm not trying to do anything, I want to get help or whatever. And they were just like, the cops, you could tell by their body language and how they were talking to the guy, it wasn't their first time, not just with him, but with people like this. And they're just like, they don't know what to do. The guy is just saying, I want help, and the hospital staff is like, our policy says we call the cops when this guy acts this way, or like people act that way. And it's like, you create this scenario where, I think there was a chart that someone put where it's like, as the hospitals to help people decreased, the prison population increased. Mm-hmm. And granted, like, we've had COVID, we have all these different things, there could be other stressors going on. It's a very complex equation there, but I just wonder how many people are being treated by being locked into boxes, which is like the worst. Like, that's like 200, 300 years ago. Yeah. I mean, at one point in time, there were bedlams and stuff where we used to lock mentally ill people in cages in the dark. And the innovation there was, hey, maybe if we didn't lock them in the dark, we treated them like humans, clean them up and listen to them, they would do better. It's like, wow, what an earth-shattering idea. And it feels like this approach with mental illness nowadays it's like pseudo like that. Like, a prison is in many ways like just being locked in the dark and forgotten and not get the help you need. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a big movement to deinstitutionalize mental health and move people out of mental hospitals because of the issues you mentioned. People were kind of locked up in cages and mistreated a lot of the times. And in the 1950s, we kind of had a pharmacological revolution where things like antipsychotics were suddenly on the suddenly in play, and they weren't an option before. And they helped people enough where they thought that they could close all these mental hospitals. And but the issue was they kind of just, like you said, people either ended up in the streets or in jail if they, weren't properly medicated. And, a lot of times the medication stopped working after a while. And, there's definitely been issues with institutionalizing people, but, there's, I think, a place for it as well in some cases. And, like you said, some people are probably better off getting that help than just being left to suffer on their own on the street or in prison. Yeah.
I wonder if I think most insurances will cover like a yearly health checkup. I wonder what it would be like if, like, every year you take all of the United States could take one day and like a schedule or whatever, right? You take one day where you get your physical examinations, get whatever, and you have like 3 meetings with a psychologist leading up to it. And, if you have to do like, some more deep therapy, like what psychedelics can do, you can just all hit that in one day. You get one day off to get everything taken care of. It's one day dedicated to you. How much more productive and happy would people be with just a simple thing? Does everyone need psychedelics? No, I don't. I think actually, I'll just put that to you. I don't think everyone needs psychedelics. I think it's like really for more severe stuff.
Yeah, no, I don't think psychedelics are for everybody. And I think, some people are going to be worse off for taking psychedelics than if they hadn't taken psychedelics, and that's a big issue, or big question for the field right now is how do you tell that? How do you predict that? Who's going to be a good candidate for psychedelics and who's going to be a bad one? And right now it's pretty rudimentary in terms of our ability to predict how people are going to react to psychedelics. That we have this screening where we exclude people for cardiac conditions because we know that the drugs acutely increase heart rate and blood pressure. We don't want to trigger a heart attack or anything like that in somebody who's sensitive to something like that. And we screen out people with a personal or family history of bipolar or schizophrenia, just out of abundance of caution, out of worry of triggering some kind of manic episode or some kind of psychotic episode. And those rules have been in place, like I said, out of abundance and caution, because this is a very sensitive topic and field, and researchers had to be very careful when starting their studies. They'd be very particular about who they were giving these drugs to or not. And so there's anecdotes about people with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia having adverse reactions to psychedelics, but it's really hard to tell what the true prevalence is. And we're actually doing a study here at UCSF right now for people with bipolar type 2 disorder, and using psilocybin therapy in them. The thinking being that bipolar includes both manic states and depressive states. And so we're going to try to treat the depressive aspect of the bipolar type 2, given the accumulating evidence for psilocybin therapy and depression. Type 2 bipolar is the less severe variant or version. There's type 1, type 2. Type 1 includes full-blown mania and full-blown depression. Type 2 involves hypomania, which is as the word would imply, a more milder form of mania. And so we're starting with this, less severe populations, less vulnerable population. And it's really the first, systematic clinical investigation into, psychedelics in that population. But up until now, we've been pretty careful about who we give it to, because we know it's not for everybody, but it's been, very hard to disentangle what's myth and misinformation from true evidence, given the moral panic around psychedelics in the mid 20th century, as well as just how hard it is to study psychedelics, given their very robust psychoactive effects. It makes it hard to do double-blind trials on their benefits, as some of my papers have gone into. But on the other side of that coin is it's very hard to tell what's true of their negative side effects as well.
Yeah. Would it be what benefit could there hypothetically be for treating the hypermania as well? I imagine, from what I understand of psychedelics, I'm really boring, so I don't drink or do anything fun. But from what I understand, it gives you context, and it makes your brain more moldable. I think that's a lot of ways people describe it to me, it makes it more elastic. But it returns it to a state of plasticity, I think. But if it could work in the down state, I wonder if it could work equally as well in the up state when you have hypermania to give context. But I'm wondering, do you think it would do anything there?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah. I haven't heard any evidence of it. I know that our lab has done some research into this I haven't been involved with, by surveying Reddit posts and things like that, and looking for people who mention that they have bipolar and took psilocybin, as well as sending out surveys to bipolar research organizations and things like that, and they'll send out the surveys to their clientele, and assessing their psychedelic use and their symptoms. I'm not sure, to be honest, though, what the findings of that were, but I know that that's the first kind of initial exploration of that area that it's going on right now. Yeah.
Well, it makes me think of this idea where it's if someone's unwell but they're happy, no one really says anything. But what if you just went around smiling the whole time, but you have something going on, if it could still be addressed in a healthy way, maybe there's something there. If you could have bipolar, but in the way you're addressing it, for instance, it's just addressing the downside of it, when you're really depressed, which makes sense, right? There's some really bad stuff that'll happen when you're in that state, but there's also stuff that'll happen if you're hypermania. I mean, I'm thinking more of the mild form where you're just having a good day, not the hypermania, but I wonder if maybe that's a component of it as well. It's oh, you're energetic and having a great day or something, and you're just really excited to do stuff. I wonder if that doesn't trigger people to think oh, this is something that we should research, versus something as compelling as depression. Everyone if you see someone depressed, there's every mirror neuron in their whole body, in their brains, that says I want to help that person. I understand that sadness.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it kind of gets back to we have a much better understanding of depression than mania, I feel just because it's so much more prevalent. And so, so we've seen some mechanisms that, predict changes in depression with psychedelic therapy, including things like mystical type experiences, which are characterized by people having this, transcendence of time and space, this, ineffability. They can't describe it in words, this very positive mood, loss of time. I already said that. And so those types of experiences predict changes in depression, as well as experiences of extreme insight during the psychedelic state. And I don't know that those two mechanisms that have been identified for improving depression symptoms, I don't know if there's any reason to think that would improve manic symptoms necessarily. There's I guess it gets back to my own kind of ignorance of what causes mania anyways. I don't really know the mechanisms involved.
Do you think it's just perception in terms of the brain, kind of like how I perceive dreaming is just to be this emergent phenomenon we do to remember, like train ourselves on what we experienced that day and then rest and repair for the next day, where and like people aren't actually like breaking out of the 4 dimensions that we exist in and going to like a 5th or higher dimension, which is, I think, mathematically, like there are other dimensions that you could go to. I think like time, if like a scientist said, like if we understood time well enough, it would be like driving around, like we don't understand it so well. Do you think the brain has the capacity to do what people perceive it to be doing, or is it just kind of like dreaming where they think they're doing what they think they're doing?
It's an interesting question. I guess it depends on what you mean exactly. Like if you mean like, I know sometimes with like DMT specifically, people report being in this like altered reality, in this like hyperspace reality where they're actually able like to interact with entities and say that they're very sure that these are real sentient beings and like that they veridically exist outside of their head. I don't think that there's any evidence to suggest that is true. I know of. Well,
I was referring more to like this perception of being like out of time, out of time and space. Like the hexagonal aliens or whatever people report. I feel like it's separate. I was just wondering about the perception of the 4 dimensions.
That specifically. I would think that would just be. It's very unlikely that they actually transcend those dimensions. More likely that they're neural processes that support processing of those things is probably altered by the drug. That would be my suspicion.
That'd be wild if it was true, though. Well, I also think it's kind of wild that the animals that were like just needed enough mathematical computation, like throw a stick at something to knock it out and eat it, could do calculus. Like our brains are just so cool like that way. But
that always blows my mind too. Just like how much math goes into just catching a ball or something like that.
And humans are the best throwers in the animal kingdom. Like no one can throw like us. But anyway, so for
I didn't know that.
No one can throw like us, and we also are. We can like run without. We can like keep going forever. We're like the Energizer Bunny of the animal kingdom.
Have the most endurance.
Like people. I think there's even competitions now where people will like try and run down a horse or something. Like they'll just slowly, like a deer or a horse will eventually just give up and sit down, and they're just like, all right, I got you, and they give up. But for adverse effects, do you think it's possible to ever get it to the point where we understand it well enough where there won't be any adverse effects? Well, I guess the extreme of that, like if you understood it perfectly, then there would never be any adverse effects. But in the sense of, do you understand like what causes the adverse effects? Like what further research needs to happen to understand the causes to the point where we could, if you're suffering bipolar and you still have like those an adverse history, there's a way to administer it where you wouldn't have those problems per se.
It's a great question. So it's very unlikely we'll ever completely get rid of adverse effects, just like with any other drug. Every drug is always going to have risks. The challenge is always to weigh the risks and benefits and to figure out how to maximize the benefits and minimize the risks. And seem to have developed a pretty good method for minimizing risks and maximizing benefits with this general psychedelic therapy model. In clinical trials, pretty regularly, reliably, and robustly, people are, experiencing improvements in mental health overall and overall well-being, at least for some time after these psychedelic experiences. And, there have been, the things that we do in these trials to facilitate that and to put scaffolds in place include the screening that I alluded to before. Meeting with the therapist beforehand, establishing rapport, talking about expectations, going through psychoeducation about psychedelics so that you understand what you're getting into, and developing like that trust with the psychotherapist is very important. and having them present during the dosing session, doing it in a safe space that's kind of cut off from the outside world, that you can really let yourself go in. That's really important. You know, you don't want to, we have to worry about, did you leave the oven on? Is there a candle going that my cat's going to knock over? Or is there, did I lock the door? Things like that. It's really important to actually have people in place to hold the space. I think that's can't be overlooked, because having somebody there to really hold the physical space really allows you to let go psychologically and to really, really just focus yourself on the inner experience, which is the key here. That's why we have people put eye shades on during the experience, and, they put headphones on, and we really encourage them to go inward. And, so doing all that, and then meeting with the participant afterward and during what's called integration sessions to make meaning of the experience, and to integrate those insights that they had during the dosing session into their everyday lives going forward, so that they can, make long-term changes. And so, with all that scaffolding in place, we've really been able to minimize the adverse effects in these trials. Some people, rebound in their depression and anxiety symptoms after some time. That's definitely been seen. They're better for 3 months and they jump back up a little bit, but they're still below where they were at baseline generally. So people seem to be very much better for some period after the dosing session and come back a little bit, but are still, better than they were before. It seems to be a pretty common trend. Yeah. There seems to be this. Oh, go ahead.
No, I think you're going to answer the question I had, which is, I wonder, what's, if someone's studying it, or what is degrading to let it go back up, like where it sounds like when you take an antibiotic and it's in your system for a bit and slowly starts getting out of your system, and then you have to take another one to keep it in there to work out the illness. Right. So it's very interesting. Like it's a similar type of like seesaw effect. Yeah,
that was a good point. Yeah. And I should say that it varies a little bit by diagnoses and by psychedelic drug a little bit. It seems like with like the MDMA therapy for PTSD, people do seem to have pretty enduring changes in their PTSD symptoms. The psilocybin therapy for addictions and, alcohol and tobacco misuse, people tend to stop using and continue to stop using. It's a very objective thing to measure, if are you using alcohol or tobacco or not. You can even, measure it in their urine or saliva if you want to as well. Those things seem to be maintained, but like the mood changes with like depression, that seems to be the thing that kind of bounces back a little bit over time, at least in the few trials that have kind of monitored long-term longitudinal changes.
Yeah. But do we know why it bounces back? Do we have hypotheses as to why it bounces back like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that there's very prevailing hypotheses on that issue in the field. I would say there does seem to be this kind of afterglow period after psychedelic experiences where people are really reinvigorated. They have just had this oftentimes beautiful experience. They re-see the beauty in life. They have this very positive memory they can look back on, and I think memories just kind of fade a little bit over time. Those insights to some degree last, but the full meaning and the full feeling, with the meaning behind it, can kind of wither away a little bit over time, it seems like. Yeah. Whereas with like these behavioral changes, stopping smoking and stopping drinking, they just don't pick it up again.
It's interesting.
A little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, like, what difference. I'm thinking of like when alcoholics, for instance, like a lot of times people will move because being in that house, being near the habits, near all the triggers, is pretty bad for them. As one example, I wonder if there was one group that was, given everything and the scaffolding to keep going forward, and one that was, given like, hey, here's what you should do, but like allowed to go in their natural habitat again. Like, what would be the differences of those two things? Would it prolong the decline, or I'm just curious, like, what that would do to it.
Yeah, it's a good point. And yeah, it brings up this other point of, clinical trials have an end point always. We have to stop giving them treatment at some point, which isn't, necessarily how it works in the real world. You can keep having follow-up, sessions every month or whatever with your therapist, or a couple times a year, whatever you need to do to maintain your changes in the real world. Both clinical trials, they stop and they, just by their very nature have to have a very clear focused endpoint. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that will be interesting to explore. As these things are rolled out in phase 4, post approval, how people manage the post integration process and how those are related to long-term changes. Yeah.
Is there a psychedelic either prevailing out there that, or just that about, that isn't getting the attention that you think it deserves?
Yeah. So there's actually, like, most people don't know, there's like hundreds of psychedelic compounds out there. There's a few that are most well known, but a ton that have really not been studied at all yet. Many by this chemist here in the San Francisco Bay Area, who's named Alexander Shulgin. He lived just a few miles actually from where I'm sitting right now. He had a home laboratory in Lafayette here in the East Bay, and there is where he created MDMA, his most famous molecule. He also created 2CB and a bunch of other psychedelic molecules as well that he and his wife, Anne Shulgin, tested. And she was a psychotherapist. And so that's kind of how the whole MDMA psychotherapy started. He created MDMA and he gave it to his wife, and she incorporated it into her therapy practice. And then she was, a pretty prominent psychotherapist in the 70s here in the Bay Area, and then it kind of disseminated from there. So I'm going on a tangent there, but yeah, so now Alexander and Shulgin are now passed away, but they have left what's called the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute, which is designed to carry out study into his molecules, and so lots of those are going to begin being tested soon. I hope to be involved in some of those studies. Kind of been talking to them a little bit, but we'll see where that goes. So lots of those still to be studied. In terms of the classic psychedelics, that includes LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline. Mescaline seems to be like the very most understudied so far in this modern era of research. Probably because it lasts so long, it makes it very not pragmatic to work around in a workday. It can be like 12-hour sessions or longer, and also it can have gastrointestinal side effects which aren't ideal. And it seems like psilocybin just is a little bit more pragmatic to work with. It's 4 to 6 hour experience. Not too bad in terms of nausea when you don't take the actual fungus. You just take a pill with psilocybin in it, and easy to do an 8-hour workday with that. So right now I'd say mescaline and some of Shulgin's compounds definitely deserve some further study. I'd really be curious to study LSD more too, but it's the same issue as with mescaline. It lasts like 12 hours. It's a little bit too long lasting, and you have to have research assistants there a couple hours before dosing, a couple hours after dosing. So it's just really not very practical and doesn't really seem to have benefits that we know of, at least relative to just using psilocybin.
Yeah, well, maybe moving out to the Midwest will help because everything's so much cheaper out here. 50,000 I think goes much further out here than it does in the Bay.
That's very true.
That's like a lunch.
Absolutely.
You drive like 10 miles.
What's that?
It's like you drive 10 miles and find parking, and you're already like 20,000 in debt.
Literally, yeah,
it's wild out there.
Looking forward to that. Yeah, the reduced cost of living out there back in Michigan. Yeah.
There's a TV series called Succession. I don't know if you're a fan of it, but the show writers said that they fundamentally don't think that personality or like people change. Like there's like kind of like that Dr. House. I don't know if you're familiar with the TV show either, but throw my references out there. Where they like there's people who think that people don't change over time, which I think is weird because people clearly change over time if you just watch them. But what do you think is about psychedelics that allows people to change when it comes to their brain chemistry? And I think that illustrates what the brain can do. It's not so much like the psychedelic itself, but I think what about the brain is able to change like that? And what about psychedelics allows it to change? And then I'm just thinking about these people's successions, like mood and behaviors change differently. I wonder if personality changes as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's really the $1 million question right now. Why are these molecules in this therapy paradigm seem to be effective for so many different things in terms of making people change? It seems to be at the core of all these different trials. They help people change psychologically. What's driving that? it's not exactly known. We have a lot of different theories, ranging from molecular to network level in the brain to just purely psychological theories for this process. We do know that psychedelics engage and agonize or cause activity at what's known as the serotonin 2A receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, which is pretty widely distributed in the brain, but most commonly found in the more newer parts of the brain in terms of evolution, the more frontal cortex. And we know that the 2A receptor seems to be very important for plasticity, which is the ability for the brain to make changes in response to changes in the environment. When new environmental demands come up, we need to be able to adapt. And so that seems to be at the very heart of this, change mechanism, quote unquote, is that they agonize these 2A receptors. And agonism of these 2A receptors leads to, dysregulated hierarchically organized interactions in the brain. And, we see that, brain regions that typically aren't talking to another are talking to another more than they were before. And there seems to be increased, connectivity and flexibility in the brain. And so, these deeply ingrained patterns of behavior that people have been had a really hard time getting out of, they can suddenly oftentimes look at it from a different perspective in a different way and, have insights, and those insights seem to be very meaningful. That seems to be a characteristic effect of psychedelics, is that they make things seem very meaningful and very important. And that can really seems to be an important mechanism in traditional psychotherapy as well. You want people to have insights that feel very important and make them make changes in their lives. So yeah, you can explain it in a lot of different ways at a lot of different levels, starting at just the very strictly cellular molecular level and building up into the network and brain level into more psychological mechanisms. And depending on your disposition or your orientation, you'll probably be more likely to explain it using one of those methods. A biologist or a cellular neuroscientist, whatever, is going to probably focus on those more lower level mechanisms, and a psychologist like myself will probably focus on more those higher level mechanisms.
Is there a pet theory that you have, or a pet hypothesis that you'd want to test out?
Do you mean in terms of like how they work, or just like any?
Yeah. How they work, but if you don't have a pet theory there, and you thought of something else, I'm willing to divert.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah. I guess not at the moment. In terms of mechanism, I feel like probably in a couple of years here. Yeah, I feel like I'm still building up the infrastructure in the brain to put that together. Yeah. I don't think I have it. I don't think I have it yet. But yeah, in terms of future ideas, so much to uncover here still in the field. It's very early days relatively. It's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and basically there's been no research on the psychotherapy component yet. What makes the contextual factors around the psychedelic drug administration work, and what doesn't work necessarily. We've typically in all these trials, we've manipulated the drug between the two groups. We've never manipulated the surrounding context, which is surprising because psychedelics are supposed to be very sensitive to context. And, we all say that, this surrounding psychotherapeutic intervention and context is important and what makes it work. But, we don't really put that to the test ever. So lots to systematically still study in that area. Really interested in studying how to predict reactions. Like I talked about a little bit already, how do we figure out who these drugs, lead to good experiences with versus, bad or even traumatic experiences in some cases. That's an interesting area of study. And one other thing that's really intrigued me is the tendency for people to report feeling more connected to nature or, the universe, even people more broadly, after powerful psychedelic experiences. And that really intrigues me as well. So I want to study that some more. And at Michigan, at University of Michigan, I'm going to be working at the Michigan Psychedelic Center, as well as the Chronic Pain and Fatigue Research Center. So we'll be evaluating the therapy for people with chronic pain. So a lot of different directions there that I'm interested in. Yeah, very not
Yeah,
very related to one another, but yeah, there's so much to go through in this field still to uncover. Yeah.
Is there anything that suggests that psychedelics would have effect on fatigue and chronic pain? Yeah, it makes me think as well, tying to the first thing we talked about, which is like the war stopped the research of the gentleman who invented LSD. And then nowadays we have the Afghanistan and Iraq wars that seems to be propelling psychedelics. So it's kind of interesting if, like, you know, pain management of some kind is also a component of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I would say, yeah, the wars and subsequently the number of veterans we have that need, you know, mental health treatment, yeah, has facilitated this movement for sure. I also kind of wonder the degree to which, you know, kind of like the chaos over the last, you know, 5, 6, 7 years has also kind of let it slide under the rug a little bit. You know, like it seems like the world's kind of been in turmoil. Everyone's kind of agreed since like 2016 or so. I don't know. And so, you know, especially during the, the Trump presidency, you know, it seems like every day there was just, you know, outlandish headlines coming out. And so I think, you know, when you have 10 crazy headlines and then the psychedelic therapy is being studied kind of slides in there at number 9 or 10 or whatever, people, you know, I think there's a limit on the amount of outrage people have, and they can only direct it into so many different directions. And so I think that also kind of helps psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, so it's on the radar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then eventually it gained so much momentum that it was hard to stop. Yeah, that it was being done at these top research institutes like Johns Hopkins, NYU, UCLA, and suddenly it's $1 billion industry, and that's really hard to stop more than anything. Yeah. So yeah, so I think, yeah, those are interesting factors to consider. But yeah, going back to the main question of, you know, can these be effective for chronic pain? You know, it remains to be seen, but we do know that, you know, one's mood and mental state, their psychological state, has very dynamic interactions with your pain, such that, you know, improving depression and mood also improves people's pain. And, you know, unsurprisingly, having worse pain also makes your depression and anxiety worse. So, yeah, we know that there's these reciprocal relationships between mood and pain, and that psychedelics seem to have potential for treating mood symptoms. So we're hoping that, you know, if we can, you know, improve the psychological aspect, or psychological component for these patients, that, you know, in turn that their pain might reduce. You know, we don't think that they're going to be strictly analgesic, you know, in a traditional sense. You know, we're not going to be like ibuprofen where you take a psychedelic and your pain goes away. But we think that, you know, having a couple of high dose sessions, having these transformative experiences and subsequent changes in mood can be helpful. You know, also, you know, people often have a hard time accepting their pain, you know, and grappling with it. And psychedelics seem to have potential for, you know, like I said, changing how people think about themselves and chronic health conditions more broadly. You know, we've had these pre-positive findings in the cancer patients, and even here at UCSF, they did a study before I got here on AIDS survivors with demoralization, and, you know, they weren't going to, you know, make their AIDS go away or anything, but, you know, they could, you know, help improve, you know, how they manage their pain and their relationship with their chronic health condition. And so those are the kinds of things that we're hoping to tap into with the psychedelic therapy for chronic pain. Let's see.
I hate it when a sneeze is coming and someone's talking. It's like, whoa.
How am I going to edit this out?
No, I'm going to leave it in. People can make fun of me. But thankfully I heard everything.
Great.
Do people, when they're going through a psychedelic therapy, do they experience pain?
Like physical pain, do you mean? Or?
Yeah. Like if let's say my leg, I don't know, I had surgery on it and I forgot to take my drugs or whatever, and I had a psychedelic thing, would I be so focused on what's going on in my head that I wouldn't notice it?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are reports of people, you know, having acute reductions in pain while they're under the influence of a psychedelic. You know, there hasn't been good systematic research on it, but there are anecdotes of people saying that, you know, like, oh, during the psilocybin trip, my pain completely went away. And there are actually relatedly, there's a lot of people who use like low doses of psilocybin for things like chronic headaches and migraines. And that's actually, I don't know how it works. I don't even know like the theories necessarily, but there's actually pretty a pretty vocal group of people. They're called cluster busters, who say,
I'm
we
Googling that.
yeah, we've used psilocybin to break our cluster headaches, and it works. It helps. Yeah. And there's been a lot of, not a lot, a couple of studies out of Yale so far that have verified that and have worked with that team. So I don't even know. I can't even begin to speculate on the mechanism of why that seems to help. But yeah, it seems to help people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
Yeah. When I first heard that and that people were studying psychedelics for chronic pain, I was like, I didn't really believe it. I thought it was kind of like the cannabis craze, where everybody was talking about like the panacea, where like it's going to cure everything, every psychiatric disorder and even physical disorders now too. And I was very skeptical at first, but like I said, I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. We're not trying to make new analgesics that'll make pain go away, but we're trying to help people, grapple with their pain differently with this therapy, and to improve their mood and their depression, and in turn, hopefully they can live with their pain a little bit better. Yeah.
Yeah. So a little bit ago, you discussed how you went to the Shulgin lab in San Francisco, and it made me think of how John Steinbeck, which I don't know if people are familiar with this author, but like Mice and Men, Grapes of Wrath, etc., which is, quite frankly, I guess it's like saying, do you know who J.R.R. Tolkien is? He's like a very famous author. But at one stage of his life, him and his dog went around America, just like went all over America and visited different grounds that were very significant to him. Do you have interest to go to the different labs throughout America, like throughout the world, who are working and carrying the torch for psychedelics, kind of like a John Steinbeck? You need a dog, of course, or something. You need a man's best friend. But would you be interested in something like that? I know. Based on your Twitter stuff, you've been to Shulgin like recently.
Yeah. That's pretty close here. Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that though. It's just this week I was going for a walk and I was plotting out this idea. I even wrote it in my note app on my phone of an academic tour, like me getting some kind of van or trailer kind of thing that I could just go around in, and I could give talks at universities. And I love camping and traveling and seeing the world and stuff, so that really appealed to me. Yeah. And I was just thinking about it. I was like, I guess I have some colleagues in Florida, Louisiana, Alabama. I could do like a deep South tour. I could do like a Midwest one and a New England one. So yeah, it's actually something I was just thinking about this week. Yeah, I think that there's been a couple of researchers who have done something kind of like that. Coming out to the Bay Area, stopping at all the big stops, and hitting the East Coast and going to Hopkins and Harvard and Yale and all that. So yeah, it's something I'm definitely thinking about, especially next year when I start the new job, because it seems like a lot of my work will be remote to begin with. At least right now, even like 90% of my work is remote, except for on dosing days. And those are kind of few and far between. It's so much to schedule, and like I said, there's so much built up that goes into place in anticipation of those dosing sessions. So yeah, definitely something I'm curious about, since I work remotely so much. Yeah.
I think Starlight, the SpaceX web internet, is now mobile. You can mount that thing on top of a mobile home or whatever they're called.
This is so funny. This is such a timely conversation. Yeah, I was just thinking about this. Yeah,
I think it's literally this week too. I've really liked the idea. There's a similar idea, like for me, for like podcasting or like meeting people and like doing science stuff. But I like the idea of like, I don't know to the extent I'm polluting this idea that you have, but I wonder if you had like a convoy of scientists, and it was like over like 3 months, where like there was like where it was scheduled out so you could go and see everything, and at each different one there was like a like symposium of speakers that talked about that institution's role in research and psychedelics, like what's going on right now. And so you just have like a convoy of people just deeply interested in the field. they just loop America. That'd be pretty cool.
Amazing. That'd be so fun. Yeah, it's such an interesting tour bus too. Yeah. The psychedelic researchers. That'd be really interesting. Yeah, it brings to mind something I've been thinking about lately, which is that it almost seems like there could be a psychedelic researcher in any academic department at a university, or somebody interested in psychedelics at any academic, in biology department, chemistry department, psychology department, politics, political science, art, music, the psychedelics kind of intersect with many different areas of humanity. It seems like it's hard to imagine a department that couldn't have, a psychedelic researcher. So yeah, it seems like, yeah, something like a tour like that could definitely have a lot of appeal and, draw out a lot of people, big crowd. Yeah.
Yeah,
I've
and then
definitely found, oh, it's that.
no, go ahead.
I've definitely found in my talks, about psychedelics that they draw quite a crowd compared to when I was going around talking about, attention bias research and cognitive psych stuff that, most people had never heard of before. So yeah, I could definitely see that being a cool idea.
Yeah. You could sell it as like a mobile Burning Man.
Yeah.
And depending on the I don't know, depending on like the legality of different places, you could like do the surveys in person, I guess.
Yeah,
I'm told people do stuff like that at Burning Man. Once again, I'm boring and I do not go to these things, but this I would go to for the learning, for the science of it.
No, this is great. Yeah, I've never been to Burning Man either, but I guess it'd be interesting to observe. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's in Ann Arbor, there's a festival every year called EntheoFest. Apparently, I haven't been yet, but I was told about it by the psychedelic researchers at University of Michigan, and yeah, they've started doing that very thing. Actually, they've started giving surveys and stuff to people at EntheoFest about psychedelics, and they've actually started to publish some papers from that research. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if we get enough people sign, anyone who messages and stuff, maybe we'll coordinate something. Once again, I feel like I'm taking over your idea. We can start a convoy, which would be kind of nice too, because like you like travel, but then at the end of the day, you guys can we can all find like a park, just like hang out and like talk about stuff. I don't know, that'd be kind of fun.
Sounds like a great time. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. Now it's kind of like walking the Appalachian Trail, but instead like in RVs and just drive around America.
Yeah, I have to look into this really though. Yeah.
Yes. Well, we could start like a GoFundMe or something. I don't know. Like I don't know what. Well, it's more just like logistics of getting the other researchers and stuff on board. But I think like a series of conferences, and then like I don't know. Now I'm thinking about how to do it, like where we could raise money for nonprofits and stuff at the same time.
That'd be awesome. I bet we can find a handful of researchers interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, everyone in the comments, this is your vote. Enough people say yes, but I will spend my time and help set this up. But for you, I think it'll just naturally come from your interest to travel. When you went to the Shulgin grounds, did you see anything that surprised you as a researcher who's been studying these things for so long? There's something there that just like, oh, that's weird, or like that's interesting, or that's something I'm going to take home with me.
Yeah.
Hopefully not literally. Stealing is bad.
They did actually give us a little cactus to take home, which is really cool.
That's nice.
Yeah. Yeah. There's all kinds of cacti that they grow along the grounds there that some are mescaline containing, some are not. I'm not actually sure if mine has any in it or not. Yeah, but there's actually mescaline containing cacti are very legal. They're found all over California and gardens all over my neighborhood and everything. Actually, most people just don't know that they contain mescaline in them. Yeah, I guess I don't know. What did I take away from the Shulgin experience? It just was really meaningful to me, just to think about, that was the location that, he synthesized all these molecules, and like just to think about how much, snowballed out of what he did there was just really incredible and special. Yeah, especially just this with MDMA in particular. There's just so many people who have been healed with MDMA therapy and who have really been helped. And a lot of people have just had a lot of fun with MDMA at concerts and raves and stuff, of course. And kind of just cool to think about how much his actions in that place impacted so many different people. Of course, you always have to remember the downsides as well, and that people also have died from his molecules and have had very negative experiences as well, and to keep that in mind as well. But yeah, generally it was just it just seemed like a very historic place and very special to be at. Yeah.
Is there like a top 5 in your head? As I guess this is timely for I can ask this question. Like, is there like a top 5 places you'd want to go?
That's a good question. I'd say Shulgin's lab might be near the top. Yeah. It'd be interesting to go to Switzerland and to go to where Hoffman first synthesized LSD as well. I'm not even sure if that's an option or if there's anything there commemorating that even. But that would be an interesting place. Yeah, I'm blanking, I guess.
I was watching a Vice interview where they went to like a volcano where a guy made LSD or something. There's like a guy who made LSD or psychedelics inside of on the side of a volcano. I wish I remember the names. Yeah. I'll find
I'm
it.
not sure. Yeah, not familiar. Yeah, but there, and yeah, it would definitely be interesting to visit the Hopkins group and to see their
Hmm.
lab. Just given that that's been a very very impactful lab as well, and there's so much that has come out of just the early psilocybin work that they did there. Rick Strassman in New Mexico as well. His DMT research kind of opened the door for the Hopkins group to do their psilocybin studies. So I'd love to meet him and to tour his lab at some point. And I guess other than that, I'm sure it seems like there's something I'm very obviously missing, but I would say those are the big ones for now. Yeah.
Yeah. And if there's if anyone knows of any like underground or lesser known researchers that are good to visit, leave in the comments. Maybe that we'd add it to the map.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
In your research, you discussed debunking Blue Mondays. And so for people who don't know what a Blue Monday is, what is a Blue Monday and how does it relate to clinical MDMA? Because we were recently talking about MDMAs and it reminds me that it was on my list.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. So Blue Mondays are this phenomenon that have been reported for a while among recreational MDMA users, where they take MDMA on the weekend and get high and have fun, and on Monday feel blue. Kind of the come down after the high. And like I said, it's been talked about so much in MDMA culture that it has this term, even Blue Mondays. But there's a lot of issues surrounding MDMA use, recreational MDMA use that don't apply to MDMA use that's used clinically. And we were really wondering if some of these contextual factors around MDMA use in a recreational setting might account for the Blue Mondays more so than even the MDMA itself. And so, for instance, when people take MDMA recreationally, they buy it illicitly. It's often cut with other substances. Sometimes it doesn't even contain MDMA at all. And people often, when they take MDMA, also combine it with alcohol and marijuana and other substances as well. Again, kind of clouding the picture of the source of the Blue Mondays. Probably most critically, when people take Monday recreationally on the weekend, they do it at night, right? They're not doing it the middle of the day or in the morning. They're doing it at night. They're taking an amphetamine at night. And so they stay up all night. They don't get sleep. They're dancing, they're raving, they're sweating. They're oftentimes not drinking enough water. And so it's not surprising in the days following that they kind of feel crappy, right? And so, what we were wondering is if we give MDMA that's pure, it's sourced from a regulated laboratory. It's 99.9% MDMA, as pure as you can get it. They don't take it with alcohol or other drugs. They don't take it at night while they're dancing and they're raving and sweating and exhausting themselves. They take it during the day in a therapy session. And, in that context, do we still see Blue Mondays was the question of this paper. And what we found was that no, this is a small sample. I forget exactly how many participants, like 10 or 12 or something like that, pretty small. But at least in this small sample of participants who were given clinical MDMA, they did not show evidence of Blue Mondays. And so the point of the paper was to highlight that there are a lot of contextual factors that go into recreational MDMA use that might account for these so-called Blue Mondays. I think the title was a little bit too strong. I think we should have reworded that. I think debunking was a very strong word to use for a small sample open label study. So if I could go back, I would change the title of that paper to be a little bit more conservative. But overall, I hope the paper highlights that or gets people to think about the factors that might go into Blue Mondays beyond just the MDMA, because there are a lot of other things going on.
Yeah, and I felt like it was pretty, like written like a scientist. you covered the bases pretty well. Like, and I think it wasn't an unfair title, but I also understand the concern with being accurate as a scientist.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. What is Perry-Hand space, and why is it significant to psychedelics?
Yeah. So I don't know that it interacts with psychedelics at all. It was kind of my previous area of research before I got into psychedelics. So Perry-Hand space is the area immediately surrounding the hand, and we have, specific neurons in the brain that respond to this space, and we actually treat it very special in terms of our attention and perception, and even how we represent it in the brain. And so what we see is that there are attentional enhancements for stimuli that occur near your hand space, and it's thought to facilitate, interactions with things in the nearby space. And so my initial research when I was beginning my PhD was focused on delineating characteristics of that peri-hand space. What are the cognitive changes that occur when people attend to that space? And as well as peripersonal space, which is the space surrounding your body more broadly that you could interact with. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Then we were talking earlier about the brain's ability to rewire, to adapt and change, and psychedelics effect on that. And someone with a show called Learning With Lowell, I'm going to definitely ask about, learning. Is there a way that psychedelics could like juice learning in terms of making it so that people can learn faster, more deeply on a subject? Or would you get stuck in like state dependent learning issues?
It's a great question. Yeah, it's kind of a tantalizing question for researchers in the field right now. Because like given this kind of theoretical model that we've developed, psychedelics increase neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to adapt to change in the environment. When you put psychotherapy in that environment, the psychotherapy essentially becomes supercharged. People are more flexible and open to it, integrate things better. And so, the thinking then is, could you put other things in that container, right, beyond psychotherapy? And I think there is some very tentative knowledge or research that just came out in the last year or so on LSD improving reinforcement learning or something like that, which I really didn't dig into the details of. But it's definitely something that people are starting to think about and starting to design studies for. There's this period of neuroplasticity after the administration of a psychedelic. Can you embed other things so that people learn them better or incorporate them into their lives more successfully? So, for instance, one thing we're curious about studying is exercise. If we get people to start exercising the day after a psychedelic experience, does it stick better? Do they commit to it more because they're in this, kind of in this state where they're open to change? Is that something that could be useful? And so it's something I think that's going to be kind of investigated in this coming decade. What other things can we stick into this container, and do they stick more successfully after a psychedelic experience compared to some kind of placebo control?
Is there
early stages?
Is there any evidence that there's any neuroregeneration or actual physical changes in the brain? Like, does it spur? Like, I'm just imagining, like, taking it to where I'm thinking that if I wonder to what extent, if there was damage to the brain, if psychedelics would do anything that would potentially alleviate or like work around the damage. I think there's been some studies that, like PTSD, for instance, you can literally MRI and see the changes in the brain. And so if you're alleviating that, I imagine that to some extent you are able to do something to the brain in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's evidence, like you mentioned, that there's atrophy of neurons, specifically in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus with things like PTSD. And it's actually kind of a common feature among psychiatric disorders that there's atrophy of neurons in the prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex in particular. And, what's interesting is those 2A receptors that I referred to earlier that psychedelics, primarily agonize, they're very much found in the medial prefrontal cortex. And so that's, something to look into in the future. I know that there's been animal studies showing increased neurogenesis and things like that, at least in rats and in preclinical models, or like cellular molecular models as well. But I don't know that anyone's demonstrated, the growth of new neurons and things like that in humans with psychedelics. And actually, it's kind of a contentious debate for neuroscience more generally. Is, do people keep growing new neurons throughout their life? It's kind of the answer to that's kind of tilted back and forth over time. Yes, no, yes, no. But we do know that psychedelics definitely cause functional changes in brain activity, long after the acute effects. I wrote a systematic review in 2020 on the long-term effects of psychedelics, and at that time there had not been a single long-term neuroimaging study out on on psychedelics, which is really surprising to me. And one of the things that I highlighted in the discussion of that paper. But in the last few years, there has been a couple papers that have come out on the long-term brain effects of psychedelics, and primarily from Robin Carhart Harris's group, which was at Imperial College London. It's now here at UCSF, and the Johns Hopkins group as well.
I'm thinking if the psychedelics have the effect of making it, with people who've had injuries or have cancer, making it easier for them to accept it and go with the healing, whether it is accepting their untimely death or the pain or whatever they're going through. I wonder to what extent. I think one of the biggest things that happens after a TMI, it's a TMI, traumatic brain injury. TBI. There you go.
TBI. Yeah, sorry, I was thinking TMS. Yeah.
Yeah. TBI. Yeah. One of the biggest things that happens after a TBI is that, like, people, I mean, obviously you're gonna be like pretty depressed, like, oh, I've lost function, you know, all these different things. I wonder if there was a study that went in there to see how it would help them with just like feeling better so they could recover faster, like, you know, the motivation on it. And then at the same time, we can scan their brain and see if we can, you know, juice it that way. But I think the problem with that is, like, with clinical studies, you'd like to study one thing at a time and be as clean about it as possible. So muddying the waters in that way, while fun, interesting in terms of its ability to potentially help people in a powerful way, probably would be not the best in terms of scientific research.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the issue. You have to, like, select one thing and carefully isolate it and study it. Yeah, exactly. But I know that there are companies that are starting to look into, you know, psychedelics and TBI, and I know Hopkins group is doing a study of you know, psilocybin therapy for people with Alzheimer's and dementia, thinking, you know, it's also, they also have depression and anxiety, kind of the same approach that we're doing. You know, we treat the anxiety and depression. We'll see if their other symptoms improve in turn, because there is such a interrelationship between, you know, your mood and your cognition, and, like we also said earlier, your pain and your bodily feelings as well. Yeah.
Do we have any hypotheses or ideas onto why, for many mental illnesses, like you mentioned earlier, seem to have a regulatory change in the prefrontal cortex, which is, I believe prefrontal is where decision happens, where a lot of sentience exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's there's so many different processes that have been related to the prefrontal cortex. But yeah, primarily, like you said, like attention, decision making, kind of more higher level processes that are more specific to humans and how we think and navigate the world. I don't know, to be honest, you know, why the prefrontal cortex is related to so many psychiatric disorders specifically. You know, it probably is related to, like what you said, you know, it's important to how people think about the world and navigate themselves in the world, but that's a very hand wavy and broad statement, I guess. Yeah. So yeah, I guess my answer would be, I don't know for sure. Yeah.
Are there, when it comes to brain-computer interfaces, for instance, such as Neuralink or Paradromics, are you interested in them as a, like, to what extent do you have interest in them in understanding the brain better so you can better research psychedelics?
Yeah, I don't know too much about human-computer interfaces, specifically myself. I have written a paper on psychedelics and virtual reality, which seems like a related space to talk about. You know, talking about, you know, how there's just a lot of parallels among psychedelics and VR, and there's a lot of potential synergistic applications as well. So in terms of parallels, you know, they both obviously alter your sensory experience. They can both be used to evoke strong experiences of awe. They're also both used in combination with mental health treatments. You know, VR is a nice little supplement to use in exposure therapy. You know, you can expose people to things that they're afraid of without, you know, actually putting them in any danger, or actually in the environment. And so, yeah, there's a lot of parallels among psychedelics and VR. And I think that perhaps VR could be a useful tool in the toolkit for psychedelic therapists. You know, one, by, you know, people have developed simulations of psychedelic experiences that people can experience in VR, you know, that are supposed to approximate, you know, what you would see with your eyes closed on psychedelics. That could, you know, potentially help people prepare for the experience, maybe take some anxiety and worry off of people, especially for people who've never had a very, you know, dramatic shift in their perception and sense of altered sense of consciousness. And so I think that could be helpful. And then during therapy sessions, you know, people are in, at least at the moment, people are taking them in laboratories and hospitals, very kind of sterile, non-natural environments. And people, when they take psychedelics, often want to immerse themselves in nature. And of course, VR doesn't really immerse oneself in nature, but could at least be used to simulate some nature scenes and to gives some people some exposure to nature. In the environments or in the dosing rooms right now, we have paintings on the wall of nature scenes and murals and things like that. But this would be a much more obviously intense and immersive method of experiencing that. And so I think VR could be useful there. And then other people have posited that if you use VR during the psychedelic session, it might be helpful for integration later, if you can do the integration in that same VR environment. I don't really totally understand that argument, but yeah, some people have put that forth. And yeah, so I guess those would be the main parallels right now. It's very hard to find things to patent in the psychedelic space. It's very difficult to patent psychotherapy, and you can't patent psilocybin itself. It's been around forever. So people been kind of looking for things that they can make money off of in the psychedelic space, essentially. And so VR is one thing where they're like, hey, that's something that's very easy that we can develop intellectual property around and to use in combination with therapy. So I think companies are very interested in developing technologies and things like that we can use as adjuncts to psychedelic therapy. But in terms of the research, not much has really been done yet in that space. I think there's a group in the Netherlands that's doing DMT and VR together or something like that, but I don't know the specifics of the study, but yeah, generally we're very much at the early stages of that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's like two sides of it where it's like, oh, it sucks that there's not more money flowing into it. On the other hand, the guy who developed insulin gave it up for $1, and look at those little shits and what they did to it. Right. So maybe it's good to leave it to the scientists and the clinicians to develop something for the betterment of mankind.
Yeah.
We're talking about sight. I'm wondering, is there a difference between someone who's blind and someone who's not in terms of their experience and what they visualize?
Under the influence of a psychedelic?
Yeah,
it's a good question. Not much has been done on that recently, but in the first era of research during the 50s and 60s, I think there was a couple papers where they gave psychedelics to people who were blind. And I think what they found was that people who were blind at birth didn't have any type of visual effect or anything like that. But those who develop blindness through some kind of like ocular damage to their eye or something like that, they still had the neural architecture there to support visual processing. And so they think they were able to experience some visual effects if they developed their blindness later in life. But still, I don't think it was as immersive or salient as it would be for someone who wasn't blind. I think what I remember reading from the anecdotes and reports is that they'd see flashes of light and little dots of light and things like that. Yeah, but it'd be interesting. I'm sure there's people naturalistically using psychedelics right now who are blind. So it'd be interesting to do a more modern survey study.
Maybe during the convoy conference, we can have some people who will be there. We can survey. I always ask people about books, and when I was doing my research, I found that you recommended American Trip, and so this is like I like a two-parter here, which I normally don't get to ask because most people don't have like a list somewhere. But what about American Trip makes it a must read? And then part two of that question is, what other books would you recommend people check out? Tend to be psychedelic related. I like to read, so I'm always looking for new things to read.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think American Trip is great because it really balances the hype and the hysteria. It really takes a very, I feel like, sterile look at the history of psychedelics and very, very removed and unbiased, in my opinion. Very much just focusing on, how have psychedelics been used in so many different ways? They've been studied for mind control by the CIA. They've been studied for inducing psychosis, and early psychedelic researchers causing psychosis. They've been studied to cure or treat mental illness. They've been used to, inspire people's art and music. The psychedelics are very much like a chemical jester, I think he says. They can be anything to anyone, and that
Hmm.
is really interesting. And his explanation is that the contextual factors around psychedelic use are really important. Your expectations, the setting, your intentions, are just the critical factors in in what the outcome is. And so I think that's just really fascinating, and I think it pulls together and really ties together a lot of different areas of psychedelic research that seem kind of disparate and don't make sense, but within this framework kind of converge and makes sense to me. So I don't know, I think it was just a really, really good book that just did a good. He also is very well read in the history, which a lot of modern psychedelic researchers neglect that, which I
Hmm.
and you, I'm sure as well, don't appreciate so much. Especially I think psychedelic researchers, they kind of take it for granted. What a lucky opportunity! Like there's a whole generation of people that did this exact thing already. Why would you not try to learn the pitfalls and what made it work, or
Hmm.
the perils and pitfalls, and as well as what made it work the first time. So that's a very unique opportunity. Most researchers don't get to have previous generation who studied like the exact same thing basically. And so I really like that he focuses in on the history. I'm just gonna take a look at my bookshelf here to see what else pops out for recommendations. I definitely recommend How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. That's kind of like the go-to psychedelic book. Came out in like 2018 or so, and really,
Is that a Netflix TV show now too? I feel like How to
yeah,
Change Your
yeah,
Mind.
yep, yeah. There's a little docu-series on Netflix about that too, where he's interviewed and a lot of psychedelic researchers are interviewed. It's very much the most popular book in the modern era of psychedelic research, but I think it does a very good job of explaining what psychedelics are, what the history is again, how do they work, and where is the future going. A lot's changed since 2018, but I think a lot of it still holds up pretty well. And then the last one, if I had to pick one other, Sacred Knowledge by
Hmm.
Bill Richards at Johns Hopkins is also pretty interesting. It really focuses more on like the spiritual and the the religious applications of psychedelics, which is fascinating to me. Next one I have on my to read list is the Immortality Key. Is on a related note, I really want to read that one. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the. I have like 10 pages left. I've liked it so far. It is
Okay.
fantastic. Even
Okay.
the fun thing about books like that, which give you a different lens on the history of us as a species, where it's like it could be wrong, but what a great thought hypothesis to think
Right.
about.
It's so
Yeah,
stimulating to think about.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting, and I think sometimes there's like I think there's a term like cultural relativism where we look at the past and we assume it's people today transported then would do the same things. Like it's entirely different. Like a Roman Republic means something entirely different than American Republic. Like
Yeah.
it's like yeah. So I enjoy stuff like that. It's fun just on that principle, but there might be even greater things there. I highly recommend it. I think you'll enjoy it.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'll definitely ensure that I do that next on my list then. Yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Definitely the kind of experience I like, where you just kind of put yourself in a different world and try to think about it from their view. Yeah.
Yeah, and then for the future of you, we talked about psychedelics, we talked about your research. I'm curious, where do you want to go with your life? Hopefully, not giving you some existential dread here, but
Oh god, yeah.
do you want to write a book? Do you want to be in a Netflix documentary? Like, what is I don't know, the next 5-10 years for you?
Yeah, for me, yeah, I'll be going to Michigan this summer in August, and I'll be a faculty member there, research investigator. So it's not a tenure track position. It's like 2 to 3 years of guaranteed funding, and then I'm kind of on my own after that. And like during those 2 to 3 years, I need to find money to support myself after that time. And so
Mhm.
so yeah, the Chronic Pain Center is really good at getting the kind of grants and stuff that would need to do that. So I anticipate being able to stay at Michigan and hopefully become a professor there after this 2 to 3 year period as a research investigator, and develop a little bit more independence at that point, and have my own laboratory and start mentoring postdocs of my own and graduate students of my own potentially. I'd like to keep focusing on psychedelic research. I've done some teaching before, but I think primarily I enjoy the research aspect of academia. And yeah, it's definitely crossed my mind to write a book. I've been thinking about it more and more, especially now I've gotten to be involved in the actual clinical trials here, I feel like I have an interesting perspective kind of right from the inside of how it's all happening. So yeah, it's definitely something that's on my mind, and I would be open to, just have to find the specific focus I'd want to narrow in on. Yeah. And beyond that, maybe the academic tour would be great. Yeah.
There's a book up here called Lab Girl, and it's from the point of view of a woman being a research scientist. I think that would be an interesting template to apply to a book that you'd write from the inside with your knowledge. I'd recommend checking out maybe
Lab Girl.
Not to, I think about me physically looking interrupted your thought, but I was just trying to remember what it was called. Yeah.
No, I was able to get where I wanted to go with that. Yeah, I was curious. I was like, if there was someone coming in or what. Yeah.
Yeah. I was trying to, like, because I wanted to look to say it, because I think if with a inside perspective, Lab Girl really does give me the sense of what it's like to be a woman trying to be, doing research, not trying to be, she was actually doing, a great job.
Right.
So, I mean, you're not a girl, but at the same time, like, inspirations can be
analogous.
taken.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll definitely have to check that out. It'd be interesting. Yeah. I'd love more, autobiographical science books like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And as like a test, because sometimes I think people wait to do things. If you wonder, like, would anyone like what I'm writing, you could try doing what Andy Weir did with The Martian, where you post chapters online and then you let people's response to it dictate how you edit and change it. That's why The Martian is such a fast-paced book and movie. It's because like people responded to it, so he knew like how to kind of calibrate as he went.
That's really cool.
You could do like a web novel from the inside, and I think there's such an interest for that. Like you could do like a newsletter or I think it's Overstack or Substack or something like that. Like people will literally like, which may work to the interest in developing some more financial independence, because people subscribe and they can be like patrons or whatever it's called, where they pay you for the content. So not only are you potentially making content for a book, but you're also making content that people want, kind of like a news reporter kind of.
Yeah,
really
right.
Cool. Substack. There you go.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. I'll have to think about that. Yeah. And yeah, that's such a cool model, kind of a choose your own adventure. Like people can vote on where to go. Yeah, what would be most interesting to focus on. I like that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd be a first subscriber, the beta tester or whatever, because this stuff's very fascinating. And if you ever do it, let me know and I'll update the show notes with it so that more people can find it.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Do that. Yeah.
Yeah, as a bonus last question, you made a tweet, and I'm just curious if I could get some clarification. It's about placebo effects. So psilocybin assisted therapy for major depressive disorder is the title of the paper you were commenting on. And here's the citation for you: increased focus on what is wrong with me? My tongue, like the methods. The rigor of method. Thank you so much. I don't know what's wrong with my mouth. The rigor of that. Man,
it can happen.
Everyone's I was saying philanthropy this weekend, and it took me like 2 minutes. But the use of an inert placebo, microcrystal cellulose, really compromises the effectiveness of all the other bells and whistles intended to improve the binding. Why would an inert placebo do anything to affect the rigor of what did you mean by that? Like why would that do anything?
So when it comes to placebo conditions, you can use what are known as active placebos or inactive placebos or inert placebos. I guess I should have used inactive in that tweet, but you said inert. And so active placebos confer some kind of effect that's supposed to trick you, essentially, that you receive the active drug, whereas an inactive placebo is just an empty pill, more or less, a sugar pill that does nothing. And microcrystalline cellulose would be considered an active placebo. It doesn't have psychoactive effects, which makes it a really poor control condition for a psychedelic, wouldn't you think? Where the characteristic effect is robust psychoactive changes. So it's just really surprising that people are still using inactive placebos in this day and age, because we know that psychedelics have very distinct identifiable psychoactive effects. And so what's going to happen is people that are assigned to the psilocybin condition are going to know that they were in the psilocybin condition, and those assigned to the control condition are going to know that they're in the control condition, which really undermines the entire purpose of doing a double-blind randomized controlled trial, right? The reason we do those types of trials is to control for people's expectancies and their knowledge about the treatment under study. And so, in SSRI trials, you don't tell them if they got the study drug or the placebo. And again, this is control for what people expect to happen. And that's particularly problematic with psychedelics because people have such inflated expectations right now about what they can do and what they might cure. And, they're being bombarded with, front page covers of Newsweek and other media magazines saying this is the next Prozac, the next big antidepressant. And so people come into these trials with very inflated expectations and very much expecting to be cured of their disorder, wherever that may be. And so, when you have those heightened expectations and then they find out that they did indeed get the drug, you can have a very robust placebo effect, which we're very much trying to minimize in these trials. And conversely, if you have very hyped up expectations about psilocybin improving your depression, and it becomes obvious you've received the control condition, you're going to be very disappointed, right? And many times feel worse than if you hadn't even been in the trial at all. And this is known as the nocebo effect, kind of the opposite of the placebo effect. And so, it's really important that researchers are rigorous about what they're using as control conditions in these types of studies, because it really changes the interpretability of the data.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking, like, how would you work around some elements of that? Like, I think visually you could just have a VR on it that like gives you like it will give you nature, like maybe trick you into thinking you're having an experience, but then it wouldn't affect like the mood of it all. Like that would only be a visual, like surface level placebo that wouldn't really cover all the bases, so you could really affect it.
No, that's very we're thinking of intuitive of you. Yeah, it's much better than what most people have actually done. Yeah, in terms of control conditions. Yeah, that's I like that idea. Yeah.
Has there ever been like a really silly control condition that you're surprised someone tried? Without naming them, I guess. I don't want to be mean.
Yeah. It's a very silly one. That's a good question. A lot of people have used niacin, which just causes like a little bit of flushing in the face. And it's just like a B vitamin, basically. It doesn't do anything. This isn't necessarily a control condition, but one group of researchers in Canada, they did a kind of fake psilocybin study. It's called Tripping on Nothing, I think is the name of the paper, where they told people they were going to give them psilocybin, and they set it all up like it would be a typical psychedelic experiment. And they even had Confederates come in, fake participants who pretended they were tripping and on psilocybin as well, to see if they could get these volunteers who they told they were given psilocybin, but it was actually just a placebo, to see if they could get like a psychedelic response in them, to see if they actually experienced any visual effects or changes in mood and things like that. And over half the participants were actually tricked in that experiment. They actually thought that they got a psychedelic and reported changes in their vision and things like that, even though they were just given a placebo pill, and they were it was all driven by context and expectancy and things like that. So it's kind of one of the more interesting study designs, I think, that has come out in the more recent years. Yeah.
That is interesting. Then I know we're going over, so it's probably a good time to say thanks. And just as a quick idea, if you want to do like Jacob Psychedelics a Day, that makes sense. It just as a newsletter title. Psychedelics a Day. Perfect. Yeah. Trademark. You have to give me a nickel. So absolutely, yeah. I want to thank you so much for coming out today. Everyone listening in, thanks for being here. I think sometimes people assume that naturally progress will continue to progress, and as we talked about today with history, there was a big pause. There's been a big stymie in this field, and there was times in America where we had amendments to the Constitution banning substances. Granted, alcohol is probably good to ban, but in this case, we all have to kind of work together to see and support researchers like yourself doing work to help people's lives improve. These veterans out there, these people who have had terrible things happen to them as kids and stuff, they deserve the best in terms of treatment to have healthy, happy lives. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on today. I want to thank everyone for listening and supporting Jacob's work. And just a huge thank you, Jacob, for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great conversation, and I'd love to come back anytime.